Hello, everybody. It's Professor T, and I'd like to conduct a lecture on our first macronutrient, which is carbohydrates. And on social media, in the news, I think carbs or carbohydrates are probably the most talked about macronutrients. They've gotten a bad rap. That they're bad for you, but I'm here to set the record straight. And as nursing students, you need to know carb metabolism as it relates to specific diseases, especially type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. Carbohydrates take the form of simple or complex carbohydrates. So by distinguishing between the two, simple carbohydrates are the simple sugars, refined sugars, and those tend to absorb quickly into the bloodstream. And if they're not utilized as energy, they'll be stored as fat. So the simple carbohydrates are the ones that we need to consume in moderation. The complex carbohydrates are your starch and dietary fiber. So those are the ones that should be incorporated into the diet, especially for patients. So carbs provide a great source of energy, especially to the brain. It could only utilize carbohydrates. It adds sweetness to the diet, and of course dietary fiber, which is important when we look at GI disorders such as constipation, irritable bowel syndrome, and IBD. In chapters 1 and 2, it discussed the AMDR, which is the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. They recommend between 45 and 65% of the calories coming from complex carbohydrates. And that's typically what we recommend for patients with diabetes. Food sources of carbohydrates are primarily from plant sources, so those that follow a vegan diet, they have plentiful plant sources in their diet. There are three sizes of carbohydrates when we look at the biochemical aspect: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So your monosaccharides, as the name implies, is a single carbohydrate unit. Disaccharides are two carbohydrate units, and those include sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And it's important to note that maltose is what beer is made from. Going back, examples of monosaccharides include glucose, so fast-acting glucose, fructose, and galactose. Polysaccharides, poly means many units of the monosaccharides put together, and those include your complex carbs, starch, and fiber. So glycogen, which is a stored form of glucose in the liver and muscles, is in fact a polysaccharide. We also categorize, as I mentioned before, the simple carbs and the complex carbohydrates. So what does carbs do, and what do they do in the body? Well, carbs are a nutrient. Primary function is to provide an energy source. So it's the most efficient form of energy, and it provides protein sparing, which we'll talk a little bit more about in lecture. So if there's not adequate carbohydrate, then you'll utilize all your glucose, all your glycogen, and then unfortunately fat will metabolize, and that could form the formation of ketone bodies, which leads to acid-base imbalances and ketosis. Fiber is great. There are many great characteristics of fiber in that it adds bulk to the diet. It helps, soluble fiber helps to decrease constipation, especially those patients that take medications. Fiber may provide a protective benefit against heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers, especially colon cancer. So remember last week, we talked about the metabolism and we followed the metabolic pathway to bananas. Carbohydrates are natural sweeteners, especially in fruits. So bananas, that sweetness came from sucrose and fructose. The goal of carbohydrate digestion, so let's look at digestion a little bit further, is to break down those disaccharides and polysaccharides into monosaccharides. So remembering from last week, we begin our mechanical digestion in the mouth, which your teeth and your tongue breaks down food into the smaller pieces and mixes it with the salivary amylase. There is another amylase enzyme I want to introduce to you, and it's called ptyalin. It's spelled P-T-Y-A-L-I-N, and that also phytin allows the hydrolysis or breakdown of starch into simple carbohydrates. When the carbs get to the small intestine, the intestinal enzymes and the pancreatic enzymes work on starch to break down monosaccharides. There are specific enzymes in the intestine that you may be familiar with, and they're secreted by these fancy cells called the brush border. Lactase breaks down lactose. Sucrase, as you could imagine, breaks down sucrose. And maltase, remember beer, breaks down maltose. So the small intestine has two major functions, and what are they? Active transport, remember it involves ATP or energy. So the conversion of fructose and galactose can enter the villi, remember the villi and the microvilli, and then the fructose and galactose can go to the liver. And then the liver will convert those to glucose. So glucose can be utilized by the cells and the tissues. Here's a great summary in your textbook of carbohydrate digestion and metabolism and absorption. Glycogen, as we said, that can be used in terms of storage of glucose. So glucose is used for immediate energy. And if the body has excess glucose, it's stored in the form of glycogen in liver and muscles for later. The process of converting glucose to glycogen is glycogenesis. So remember, the ending of genesis is the beginning of. So to ask a question, and this is critical thinking for nutrition ATI, what kind of meal would turn on glycogenesis? So if you or your patient had a high carb meal, that would turn on glycogenesis because there's too much glucose in that meal and it has to be stored, the excess has to be stored as glycogen. So the end product of all this is glucose, and that's the source of energy that the cells will utilize. So glucose is the major energy source. Primary goal of metabolism, and we'll learn this in chapter 15 in diabetes, is to maintain those BG or blood glucose levels. We want them between 70 and 100 milligrams per deciliter. If you can imagine, there is always an ongoing conversion, okay, of glycogen to glucose. So if the body needs glucose in the time of like trauma or major surgery or stress, the conversion of glycogen to glucose is called glycogenolysis. So think lysis, which is that ending of the word, is analogous to breakdown. Glucose can also form lactic acid when, say, for example, in an athlete, and they've been exercising for a while and they start to get sluggish and slow, lactic acid will build up and the athlete will experience muscle cramping. Glucose can also go to the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle to form glucose. And there's also another metabolic process. I promised you that nutrition was all about metabolism, metabolic pathways. So here it is that gluconeogenesis. So neo, thinking neo and genesis, new beginning. That is when non-carb sources such as fat and protein will be utilized to produce glucose. And that we'll talk about a little bit later. That is when the body is in starvation and it utilized all the glycogen, it utilized all the glucose, and then it's going to break down fat and protein. I want to talk to you about how blood glucose is regulated in the body. It's a pretty intricate system that involves several hormones. And the hormones are regulated by the pancreas, which is, it comes to our first hormone is insulin, which we're all aware that insulin lowers blood glucose levels by helping to regulate the blood glucose uptake in the cells. It also lowers blood glucose levels by converting glucose to glycogen, which is called glycogenesis, or it converts glucose to fat in the adipose tissue. So that's the whole point of insulin, is that it allows for the efficient use of glucose as energy. Glycogen is also a pancreatic hormone, and it allows for the release of glycogen from the liver. So if a patient needs glucose, glucagon is responsible for it. The other pancreatic hormone is called somatostatin, and that's secreted by the pancreas and hypothalamus. Okay, so now we got the hypothalamus involved, and that cuts off insulin and glucagon function. So you can see that there is an intricate system to help regulate the highs and lows of blood glucose. When we get to type 1 diabetes, we'll talk about growth hormones, and they play a huge role in puberty in all patients, young patients, teens, during puberty, but it's especially challenging in type 1 diabetes. Okay, so when we talk about simple carbohydrates, the monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose, and your disaccharides are sucrose, maltose, and lactose, and they're made up of 2 glucose units. So the Food and Drug Administration regulates alternative sweeteners and sugar alcohols. There are many alternative sweeteners on the market. Sugar alcohols, typically their name will end in OL, sorbitol, mannitol, and xylitol. They still have calories, but considerably less. The one thing with sugar alcohol, especially patients that have GI issues, if they consume a lot of them, like someone that has IBS, it's not recommended, and especially in kids because it can cause diarrhea. Now, the alternative sweeteners are your artificial sweeteners that have 0 calories, and those include the ones on the market now: aspartame, saccharin, sucralose, and stevia. The middle one is salmon, potassium, I don't really see on the market. But it's important to note that babies are tested when they are born for PKU, which is phenylketonuria, PKU. And the one artificial sweetener that they cannot have is aspartame. Aspartame goes under the brand name Equal, so it's that blue packet. And the reason is because aspartame contains phenylalanine, and those with PKU lack that enzyme, so they're not able to metabolize phenylalanine. So your complex carbohydrates are the ones that you want you and your patients to consume more of, and those include starch and fiber, and especially the soluble fiber for the treatment of constipation. When we look at fiber a little bit more, it's actually the lignin in the plant that cannot be digested by humans. And there's 2 types of fiber, soluble and insoluble. So it's important to note, and this is a big ATI component, is soluble fiber, being able to identify soluble fiber. Those are food sources of dried peas and beans and lentils. And we'll talk about every culture has them. For example, your dried beans would be kidney beans, chickpeas, navy beans, soybeans. I'm Italian, so we are really big on the white northern Italian beans, and they're also called cannellini beans. And we put those in pasta and soup. So we'll talk about that a little bit in lecture. Other soluble fibers are your fruits, such as apples, pears with the skin on it, and bananas, and then also oat bran and oatmeal. Now, the insoluble fiber is the one that goes to the large intestine, and those are your whole grains. It has to be whole grain rice, pasta, and bread. Oatmeal is also an insoluble fiber. It's the whole grain part. And then insoluble fiber comes from green leafy vegetables and popcorn. So definitely know the benefits of incorporating dietary fiber into meal plans. Studies have demonstrated that a benefit in obesity will help patients feel fuller longer, so it increases satiety. It helps with type 2 diabetes, which assists them in blood glucose control. So when your grandma or your nonna or your abuelita told you about roughage, helps with constipation to increase like the gastric bulk and motility, she wasn't wrong for sure. And then, as I mentioned earlier, fiber can also decrease the incidence of colon cancer. Our last slide takes us to the recommended adequate intake. It's called the AI of dietary fiber, and it's a range that you should star and remember for ATI. So the range is 25 to 38 grams per day. For women, it's 25 grams per day, and for men, it is 38 grams per day. It's also important to know the dietary sources that are rich in fiber, and I've scaled them according to grams. So let's look at this. 4 grams of fiber rich sources include baked beans. So it's definitely a lot of different beans, kidney beans, lentils, navy beans. And then your bran cereals are very high in fiber. 3 grams is apple with the skin on it. So the skin is important to consume because that is a great source of fiber and other micronutrients. Corn, oranges, pears, peas, potatoes with the skin on it, so white potatoes, raisins, shredded wheat cereal, and strawberries. And then to round it out with the 2 grams, there's quite a bit of fruits, so apricot, bananas, blueberries. Vegetables would be broccoli, cauliflower, carrots, in addition to grapefruits and cantaloupe, pineapple, and then rye crackers and whole wheat bread and cereals are a good source of not really high fiber, but a good source of fiber. Okay, well, that's all I have for you regarding carb metabolism, and we will see each other soon. Thank you.